Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up tonight, Trump has walked back his threats to bomb Iran's power plants. He says it's because there have been very positive negotiations. The Iranians have said no negotiations have taken place, so very Trumpian. We will also, or I have a brilliant interview with Hooman Majd. He's a really, really interesting Iranian author or Iranian-American author and thinker. Such an interesting conversation. And we will be discussing the viral clip between the editor-in-chief of The Economist and Tucker Carlson discussing whether or not Israel has a right to exist or whether the question even makes sense. I'm delighted to be joined all evening by Barry Malone. How are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, very good. Good to be with you. Nice to see you redecorated.
It's nice. Isn't it? There's a wide shot now. We've just had to clean up. I just told Barry to get some of his stuff off the table because you can see it all now. You know, he's complete slob.
I was nesting in Novara.
Oh, no, you're not. I'm the real nester. I'm the real person who spreads out all my crap around the office. But I've had to sharpen up a little bit. If you'd like to support our work and get us some organisers in the background, maybe you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Of course, your money won't go on organisers. It will go on brilliant staff, brilliant reporting, so that we can continue to expand and do what we really love doing. On Saturday, Donald Trump made this pretty terrifying threat. He said, if Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate the various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. So that was a huge threat. The idea of taking out Iran's power plants, that would completely just crush the country, would be sort of completely impossible to live, essentially. So that would just be an enormous escalation. Iran, as you'd imagine, didn't budge. They didn't say, oh, okay, we're scared of your tweet, so we're going to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Instead, they threatened to bomb all major energy and desalination plants in the region. So that would especially be sort of hitting the Gulf states, many of them reliant for, I think, over 90% of their water on desalination plants, obviously because it's a very dry part of the world. So that's a huge vulnerability. Iran threatened it. The markets went a bit crazy, and Trump folded. He tacoed. Trump always chickens out. That stands for, if you're not on Twitter as much as I am. So this is what he tweeted this morning. I am pleased to report that the United States of America and the country of Iran have had over the last 2 days very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. Based on the tenor and tone of these in-depth, detailed and constructive conversations, which will continue throughout the week, I have instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. Thank you for your attention to this matter, President Donald J. Trump. That was a big relief to many. He'd sort of stepped back from the brink. And the best way, perhaps, to understand today's events is to look at the price of oil. So it started the day at $112 a barrel. Then after Trump's Truth Social post, immediately dropped to $98 a barrel. I mean, people were really, really worried about what would happen if Trump did hit Iranian power plants. Like, it really just could have gone crazy, right? So even him walking back temporarily had this big effect. And then it wiggles around a bit during the day, but it's ended up back above $100, but way below where it was at the start of the day before that Truth Social post. So what should we make of Trump's volte-face? Well, crucially, the Iranian Foreign Ministry has claimed that no talks did, in fact, take place. So they said this is all made up, essentially, by Trump to try and save face. That fact was put to Trump today.
Mr. President, Iran's foreign ministry says you're not telling the truth when it comes to productive conversations to end the war.
Well, they're going to have to get themselves better public relations people. We have had very, very strong talks. We'll see where they lead. We have major points of agreement. I would say almost all points of agreement. Perhaps that hasn't been conveyed. The communication, as you know, has been blown to pieces.
Pressed on who the Americans had been negotiating with, Trump said this.
Who is Steve Witkoff speaking with, Mr. President?
A top person. Don't forget, we've wiped out the leadership phase 1, phase 2, and largely phase 3. But we're dealing with the man who I believe is the most respected and the leader, it's a little tough. We've wiped out everybody.
Is that the Supreme Leader?
No, not the Supreme Leader.
So
We don't.
not much talk
Well,
about
nobody heard of the second Supreme Leader, the son.
Are these direct?
We have not heard from the son. Every once in a while you'll see a statement made, but we haven't. We don't know if he's living. But the people that seem to be running it, and they seem that based on really fact, because things they've said have taken place.
Mr. President,
Again,
Mr. President, I know you deployed.
because I don't want him to be killed. Okay, I don't want him to be killed.
Mr. President, you deployed.
Nobody wants to be that. Nobody wants that job right now. Nobody's exactly looking forward to being the head of that particular country. But perhaps we'll be able to solve that problem.
That's a completely crazy thing to say. He says, I can't tell you who we're negotiating with because I don't want them to be killed. Now, that would, if it were the case that Iranian leaders who negotiated with the Americans were getting killed by, Iranian rebels, maybe that would make sense, right? You say, these are secret negotiations. We know it's a contentious thing to be doing in that country to negotiate with the Americans. So we're going to keep that quiet. But the people who keep killing the Iranians who negotiate with Americans, the Iranian leaders, are the Americans. Well, I mean, more the Israelis, but the Americans and their partners in this war. So is Donald Trump saying, I can't make public who we're talking to in case I then decide to kill them? Or I can't tell you who we're talking to in case Bibi Netanyahu, against my wishes, goes and kills them? I mean, maybe that's it, right? Because it looks like Donald Trump really wants an off-ramp. Israel doesn't want an off-ramp. They want this war to go on forever. So the Americans are negotiating with someone, and he doesn't want to say publicly who it is in case the Israelis just come and bomb them to death. Of course, I mean, the Israelis are happy to be quite indiscriminate, so I don't think Trump would need to name the particular person for them to try and kill them. In terms of who they are, an Israeli official today told Axios that US envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner had been in touch with the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, one of the most senior political leaders in Iran. Ghalibaf, though, denied that on X. So he said, Iranian people demand complete and remorseful punishment of the aggressors. All Iranian officials stand firmly behind their supreme leader and people until this goal is achieved. No negotiations have been held with the US, and fake news is used to manipulate the financial and oil markets and escape the quagmire in which the US and Israel are trapped. Barry, what's your read on the situation? Do you think negotiations did take place? I mean, there have been some conversations that, the Americans maybe reached out to people. It doesn't seem like there were any kind of formal talks. And the fact that Trump tweeted this now isn't because, today there'd been exceptional talks. It's because he wanted to back out of the deadline that he made up for himself.
Yeah, and because he was terrified of the market's reaction and the absolute battering that the global economy is taking. Look, I don't know. None of us really know, right, whether the talks took place. But the data points that we do have is that the American government lies about this, about their relationship with Iran, more than Iran lies about their relationship with the US. Right? We've seen that over the last year. We saw that in the lead up to the 12-day war that happened last year. We've seen it over the last few weeks. So based on past form, you could imagine that Trump is telling porkies here. But I think it speaks to the kind of the fear that he's feeling right now as Iran continues its kind of war on the global economy. I think I said this on Novara last week. We're looking at the world's global plumbing system being absolutely shaken to its core, and it doesn't seem like he knows what to do about this. We have U.S. allies who are sort of, giving a little bit of lip service to saying they vaguely support what they're doing. But it's very clear that most global powers do not support what he is doing in Iran. So I think that, maybe he's been surprised by the fact that there will be no help really forthcoming in opening the Straits of Hormuz. I think the Japanese said today that they might engage in mine clearing after a truce is reached and not before. And effectively, to reopen the Straits of Hormuz, they'd have to at least put US troops on the coast, if not on the ground, on the coast at the very least. Otherwise, I don't see how how you open it. And then the other thing is, Iran doesn't even really need to mind the Straits of Hormuz to some extent, because Lloyd's of London can close the Straits of Hormuz by refusing to give anybody the insurance necessary to travel through it, or making insurance premiums so bloody high that it's not economically viable for shipping companies to travel through. So I think what's happening is Iran's strategy, which, by the way, was signposted for decades, is proving incredibly, incredibly effective. And I think that that's rattling Trump more than anything, because we already know that the war is not popular in the US. It's unpopular in the US, even with his MAGA base, and toppling the Iranian government was never a MAGA project. So he's now engaged in a war that's unpopular with the American public, that's unpopular with his base. He's looking down the barrel of midterm elections in November, that all current polling points to the Democrats taking the House and rendering him a lame duck president. So right now, it looks very much like, and I think particularly if you slice this post on Truth Social as a sort of an act of desperation to look as if he is getting his arms around the impact on the economy, Iran is kind of winning in a way, right?
Yeah, they're suffering and winning.
Well, right.
They're let's say their deterrent strategy appears to be working.
Right, but if the goal was
began.
to topple the government, we have lots of reporting coming out. For example, I read a piece on AP that quoted anonymous US intelligence officials that said that the Iranian government as an entity is holding together.
Yeah.
So, as Trump says, we've wiped out tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, I don't know who's bloody left, but according to US intelligence agencies, there is still a functioning government and a functioning state. And so that goal, which we absolutely know is a key goal of Israel, that's the goal of Israel, has not been achieved. And now, as you say, we're looking at Trump perhaps looking for an off-ramp. So if that happens, then they haven't achieved their objective. Certainly Israel hasn't achieved its objective in Iran.
Yeah, so that's the big fear, that Trump wants to chicken out, and that the Israelis will somehow find a way not to let him. I've got a bit more on this with Hooman Majd later on in the show. So I want to, for now, move on to another development which happened over the weekend. So this was the big headline on Saturday morning.
Iran has launched 2 missiles at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, where there is a joint UK and US military base. Neither of the missiles struck the base, which is used by American heavy bombers. But it's around 2,370 miles from Iran's coast, and the attack demonstrates that the range of Iran's missiles is much greater than previously thought.
So the apparent missile strike aimed at Diego Garcia generated some fairly alarming commentary.
The reach of Iran's missile capabilities may be much longer than expected, as Diego Garcia is 2,500 miles from Iran. Given that range, more European countries could be at risk of a missile strike.
The Daily Mail ran with this headline. They say UK has no defences to stop Iranian missiles and would be forced to rely on US and Europe to stop them. As it's revealed, they can now hit London. So the basis of the idea that they can hit London is that London's not much further away from Iran than Diego Garcia is from Iran. Other commentators suggested this missile strike proved Iran can't be trusted. So Ian Bremmer is president of the influential Eurasia Group. He said this: turned out the Iranian government was lying about not developing any ballistic missiles with range beyond 2,000 kilometers. Hardly surprising, but justification for removing their ballistic missile capability militarily. Other analysts, though, provided what I think were quite useful correctives. So Dr. Jeffrey Lewis is an arms control expert. He responded to Ian Bremmer by saying this: Bremmer's framing is common but wrong. Instead, Iran was developing an ICBM when Khamenei imposed a 2,000-kilometer range limit. The program then shifted to space launch. However, Khamenei lifted the restriction in October 2025 after the June attacks. Now he's dead, and here we are. So the idea, they weren't building anything above 2,000 kilometers, but then we went to war with them, so they thought maybe we will. Others have pointed out that a missile which can reach 2,000 kilometers with a large payload can often be made to go further with a smaller payload. So the payload, the explosive which is attached to it. So if you've got a missile, the Iranians had before the war, I think, said that the limit was 2,000 kilometers for their sort of ballistic missiles. But if you've got a ballistic missile which will go 2,000 kilometers with a big bomb on the end of it. If you remove the big bomb, it will go further because it becomes a lighter rocket. They'll be less likely to hit their target because the further they go, the less accurate they are. The community secretary, to his credit, has also said there was not really any cause for alarm.
The Iranian terrorist regime poses a global threat with missiles that can reach London, Paris or Berlin. Is that true?
There is no specific assessment that the Iranians are targeting the UK, or even could if they wanted to. We have the finest military in the world. We are perfectly capable of protecting this country and keeping this country safe, whether it's here at home or whether it's our assets and nationals across the region. Well, you'd need to speak to the Israelis. You know, whatever people might say, the UK is not going to be dragged into this war, but we will take appropriate collective defensive action to keep our nationals and our interests safe.
But Secretary of State, everyone watching this morning will want to know, are you saying that it is not true that Iran could hit European capitals, Paris, Berlin, London?
I'm not aware of any assessment at all that they are even trying to target Europe, let alone that they could if they tried. But even if they did, we have the necessary military capability to defend this country, and defending the British national interest is precisely why we're taking part in collective defensive action across the Middle East. But whatever people might say, whatever speculation there might be, this country will not be dragged into this war.
But Secretary of State, that's not speculation. That is an on-the-record statement from one of our allies. If that is not true, which is what you're saying...
It was very much conditional, the language that he used there. He used a could. There is no assessment to substantiate what's being said.
So why would Israel say something that is not true?
Well, you'll need to ask the Israelis.
Why would Israel say something that's not true? That couldn't possibly happen, would it? So also, she hadn't really bothered to do any research about missiles or anything. She's read an Iranian tweet, a tweet from the Israelis, and then he's given a fairly decent answer, considering he's Steve Reed. She says, why would Israel say something that's not true? People have defended it, saying she's asking the question to try and provoke an interesting answer from the politician, which, there's something to that. I'm not sure she asks similar questions about other countries, but there we are. To add further complications to this story, Iran is now denying they shot missiles at Diego Garcia in the first place. So its foreign affairs spokesperson said this today on X, that even the NATO Secretary General, who is infamously pressing alliance members to appease the US and support their illegal war on Iran, declines to endorse Israel's most recent disinformation, speaks volumes. The world has grown thoroughly exhausted with these tired and discredited false flag storylines. So he's referring there to Mark Rutte, who said the alliance, so NATO, cannot confirm Israel's claims that Iran launched the missiles. The UK does appear to be confirming them, but there's no evidence that exists beyond the Israelis saying it and the Brits saying it, the Iranians calling it a false flag. One of those situations where I feel like I'm unqualified to say whether or not this missile was sent. I mean, people were saying this was maybe Iran giving a warning shot to the Europeans to say, don't assume you're safe. If this war escalates, maybe it will sort of come to your countries, and therefore I suppose you should put more pressure on the United States. You should not let the US use your bases. I mean, we are letting the US use our bases to attack Iran. Some people saying that. Other people saying that actually this whole story, either it didn't happen or it's being massively overplayed by the Israelis because they're trying to draw the Europeans into the war because they want us to see Iran as a threat to us, not just to Israel. I don't know which of those you find more plausible. Maybe you've got some back channels. Maybe you do know someone who's personally confirmed that the missiles were shot towards Diego Garcia.
I do not. I think that, even on the last thing we just spoke about at the beginning about whether or not Trump had been talking to Iran, we're constantly in the midst of this thing engaged in sort of a he said, she said between either sides. And lies are being told all over the place. So am I going to sit here with absolutely no convincing reporting either way and make a judgment as to whether the missiles were actually fired? No way. Although I do think it is very significant that NATO said earlier that it had, no knowledge of it happening. I think that's really surprising.
I mean, it might be that might be a technicality, right? It might be that sort of NATO wouldn't. That's an issue for Britain and America. It's not a NATO base, so if NATO hasn't bothered to ask, I don't know.
It's unusual for them to be drawn on something like that, though, if they don't have the information. But I do take your point. But also, you got to sort of wonder if, as you said, the Iranians were trying to fire a literal warning shot. Then why would they disavow it? Unless they think that the way that something like that could be spun may backfire on them, because then you have this story about Iran being able to hit London and Berlin and Paris and etc. But look, what seems clear, and I think it's good that Steve Reid came out today and poo-pooed this, and Keir Starmer did too. I think Keir Starmer actually went further. The government is saying that there's no evidence that Iran can hit the UK with an ICBM. But Starmer said there's no evidence that Iran would even want to hit the UK with an ICBM, because he said that there's no evidence or no assessment that Iran is seeking to target the UK, right? Not alone can they probably not do it, they don't even potentially want to do it.
Yeah.
But guess who wants us all to believe that they do want to do it and that they can do it? Israel. And that's why they have seized upon this today, and they're putting it out all over. And look, the compliant right-wing media in the US with Fox News and in the UK with the Daily Mail are stating this as if it's fact now. Like, look at that Daily Mail headline. Does it source that? It doesn't even source it to the Israelis. It literally just screams in the headline that Iran can now hit the UK.
Revealed. Iran can hit the UK.
Exactly. Even a more responsible headline would say, Israel says, right? They don't even bother.
At least Laura Kuenssberg said that. It's not our war, right? We're not buying it. We're not going to take this psyop to suddenly believe that this random ass war that the Israelis and Trump started to destroy a country that has not really done any harm to us. We're not buying that suddenly we're involved because there's some nonsense story about how missiles can hit us in 45 minutes. Remember that one?
Oh, God. And we've had stories about how Iran is going to, there was a plot to assassinate Donald Trump. Right, that was one that was featured heavily on Fox News. Even Netanyahu put that one forward. We've had Iran is going to launch sort of quote-unquote terrorist attacks on the UK. We've had Iran is going to target synagogues in the UK. And now we have Iran can drop missiles on London. Look, I think it's clear that there's absolutely no evidence to support it. And I think it's probably clear that it's a bunch of nonsense.
Much more deadly than any bombing that may or may not have been fired at Diego Garcia have continued over the weekend. It's included tit-for-tat strikes against nuclear facilities in Israel and Iran. So on Saturday, Israel and the US bombed Iran's Natanz nuclear installation, which is used for the enrichment of uranium. In retaliation, Iran bombed Dimona, I hope I pronounced that right, where Israel's nuclear program is based. This is footage from that latter strike.
Whoa. 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 Abba. Whoa. Whoa.
Clearly got through the Iron Dome. Later the same day, another Iranian missile hit the city of Arad, about 25 miles from Dimona. That reportedly injured dozens of people. As missiles fired between Israel and Iran dominate the headlines, though, Israel has been escalating its war on Lebanon. So on Sunday, Israeli forces bombed the Kashmir Bridge in southern Lebanon, which is a key crossing that links the south to the rest of the country. Lebanon's President Joseph Aoun said the attack was a prelude to a full-scale ground invasion, and the Israeli military has confirmed it is planning to expand its ground operations in Lebanon. This comes amid warnings from Amnesty International that Israel is repeating the same strategy in Lebanon as it has used to annihilate Gaza. Israel has already displaced more than 1 million people in Lebanon since late February and killed over 1,000, including 118 children and 40 health workers. That's according to the country's health ministry. And while Israel continues to fight across the Middle East, settlers in the occupied West Bank are ramping up terror against Palestinians there. Footage shared online by human rights activist Ihab Hassan shows cars burning in the Palestinian village of Jalud. This was too much even for some Israeli politicians. and the leader of the centre-left Democrats Party, Yair Golan, said, quote, Jewish terrorism is spreading, exploiting the war with the backing of extremist ministers and dangerous encouragement from the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister. Barry, I suppose that what's going on in Lebanon seems particularly dark. I suppose, I said this before, it's because there aren't many choke points in Lebanon. So sort of the reason why the war in Iran really has potentially backfired for America is because Iran has some really effective choke points that it can put pressure on. So the Strait of Hormuz really has impacted Western countries everywhere, the fact that they've closed it, and that is enormous leverage. The Lebanese, I don't know if Lebanon has any choke points, which means that Israel can go to war with them, and it's a humanitarian crisis as opposed to a sort of political economic one.
Yeah, and Lebanon has had one of the world's worst economic crises for the last few years. I mean, at one point, its economy had essentially collapsed. And, it certainly does not need this. I fully agree with Amnesty International's evidence or assertion when you look at all the evidence and all the reporting that this does look a lot like the Gaza playbook happening in Lebanon. And when you look at the stats, the numbers of people killed, the number of people displaced, the number of buildings destroyed, it actually is really, really stark. I think we have over 1,000 people killed now in 2 weeks. We have more than 1 million people displaced. That's in a country of about 5 million people, or just over 5 million people. These are huge, huge figures. Israel is saying that it's stepping up its attacks on Lebanon, that it's stepping up its involvement on the ground in South Lebanon. But it's been there for heading for a year and a half. We had a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in November 2004, and it was that typical Israeli ceasefire. The ceasefire that's not a ceasefire, the quote-unquote ceasefire, because since that ceasefire was agreed, Israel has continued to attack South Lebanon on an almost daily basis. And Hezbollah did not attack Israel, despite all of those Israeli attacks, until this month when Ayatollah Khamenei was killed in response to that. Otherwise, they had not fired a single rocket at Israel in the face of about 1,000 Israeli attacks. I saw on Al Jazeera today that Hezbollah fighters do appear to be engaging Israeli soldiers on the ground in South Lebanon today, as I think that they have the right to do under attack, and when Israel is occupying illegally southern Lebanon right now. When you watch the Western media, they say Israel has crossed into Lebanon, Israel is stepping up its operations in Lebanon. No, Israel is currently occupying Lebanon in the same way that it occupies Gaza, in the same way that it occupies the West Bank, in the same way that it occupies East Jerusalem. That is what is happening. And the thing is that it's happening all under the cover, right, of the war on Iran, because eyes are off Lebanon right now. People aren't watching closely, and Israel just keeps pressing this. I mean, I'll say it again. More than 1 million people displaced in 2 weeks. That is, by any measure, a huge humanitarian crisis. And again, just underlines the fact that, I'm sorry to say, no country in the region is currently safe from Israel, which is a rogue state.
Does Trump backing down on threats to bomb Iranian power plants show an end to this war could be imminent? And if the war does end, what kind of Iran would it leave in its wake? I spoke to an absolutely fascinating guest to get an answer to these questions. Hooman Majd is an American Iranian journalist and author. He's written 4 books on Iranian politics and has also worked as a translator for not one but 2 Iranian presidents, both on their visits to the United States. I began by asking whether he believes Donald Trump's explanation for backing down on his threat to bomb Iran's energy infrastructure. Namely, he said this had happened because America had been having very good and productive talks with the Iranians.
It seems very, very unlikely. I mean, his most recent statement at the air base where he was getting on Air Force One, he said that they called. They realized that I was about to bomb at morning Tehran time on Tuesday morning, their biggest power plant. They were about to, they knew that was going to happen. $10 billion power plant gone, one shot. These are his words. And they called. I didn't call. They called, and they want to make a deal. It just seems incredibly unlikely. He gave this ultimatum at night, 8 o'clock at night. None of his aides would have been around. He's sitting there on social media saying, okay, what am I going to do now? And he tweets that, or posts that he's going to blow up a power plant unless Iran opens the Strait of Hormuz. And the Iranians immediately said, if you try to blow up a power plant, we will attack, infrastructure in the region, presumably desalination plants. That's the easiest thing for Iran to attack at this point. In Dubai, for example, I guess most of their drinking water comes from desalination plants. So that's what Iran said. It's possible, it's likely, I should say, that they would be able to go through with that threat, the Iranians. And so why they would, call in the middle of the night or on Sunday morning, hey, Mr. Trump, we want to make it. Who are they going to call, first of all? The only person who has had any contact at all since the June war, last year, is Steve Witkoff and the Iranian foreign minister. It is possible that the Iranian foreign minister has had or has gotten exchanged messages from Witkoff, the negotiator. It's also entirely possible that Oman or one of the mediators, Turkey, who do talk to Iran and are friendly with Iran, or even Qatar, have passed messages from one to the other. But, no, he's not getting a phone call from President Trump, even though all journalists in Washington, D.C. have his phone number. The Iranians might have it as well, but I don't think they're calling him on his cell phone saying, we want to make a deal. That's just preposterous.
So the most plausible sequence of events, you seem to be suggesting, I definitely agree, is that Trump made this threat, Iran made their counter threat, to attack energy and desalination facilities in the region, and Trump backed down because he saw that outcome as being too damaging. Iran have come out and said these talks didn't take place. I mean, is there a world in which they should have gone along with it? Because, looking at Washington, it seems like Donald Trump is trying to find a way that he can withdraw the Americans from this war while saving face. Should the Iranians maybe just let him save face?
Well, no. I think as far as the Iranians are concerned, no. Because what the Iranians want after this war is over, and it will be over at a certain point, what they want is to be in a much stronger negotiating position than they were right before the war started. And they will be, because now they've shown that they can withstand this assault, massive assault by both Israel, two superpowers, basically, at least nuclear powers, and one great superpower, for now going into the fourth week. And, the country is still operating, stores are still open, the regime is still there despite having some of its top leadership gone. So what they're going to want out of this is that they're not going to want a premature ceasefire. They're not going to give him a way out. They're going to extract, at least this is what they're trying to do, in my opinion, and what they've sort of indicated in so many ways that they're trying to do is extract as many concessions from Trump that they can. They would have made a deal with Trump, with Witkoff, on that Thursday before the war in February that was much better than Obama's deal. And Trump could have taken it and said, I made a better deal than Obama, which all along is basically what he wanted to do. Whether he was pushed by Netanyahu, whether there's some of the hawks in the Senate here, Ted Cruz and Lindsey Graham were pushing him, other hawks, think tanks like FDD, were pushing him to go to war. Other Iranians, including in the exile, including the Shah's son, who wants to be the new Shah or wants to be the new leader in Iran. Whatever it was, he decided to go for it. So now the Iranians are saying, well, what we need is an absolute non-aggression pact so that there's no more wars after this one. You can't attack us again. You've done this twice. You can fool me once, but you're not twice.
I mean,
as George Bush said. So I don't think Iran should have, probably in their own minds, given him a way out. At the end of the day, they also know that Trump is the kind of person who, if he wants a way out, he'll just declare it. He'll just say, I won. And if that's what he wants, he'll do that. But Iran wants concessions. They want sanctions lifting. They want all kinds of things that puts them in a better position. And in all probability, if you think about it, Trump will probably give them that in order to stop the war. I mean, let's also look at what happened today. The Dow Jones jumped up by, I think, 3% already. Over 1,000 points and every stock market index is up. Oil probably went down, and the 5 days conveniently gets you to Friday evening at 8 p.m. when the markets are closed, and he can go into the weekend and either attack or not attack, but he can at least, it gives him 5 days to figure out, is there a way for me to get out of this? Is there an off-ramp for me that I can save face? And if not, maybe I do attack on Friday night.
Escalating every Friday night after the markets close and then de-escalating every Monday morning before they reopen is a very sort of macabre form of Groundhog Day. In terms of what kind of agreement they could come to, you're sounding actually more optimistic about it than most people I've spoken to, because lots of people worry, how can these two parties come to any kind of agreement when they've been torn up in the past? When Trump agrees anything, it doesn't tend to be worth the paper it's written on. Last time the Iranians went into negotiations with the Americans killed their leaders. So is it plausible to suggest that there could be any kind of deal to end this war?
I'm not sure the deal is to end the war. I think the war ends first, almost. I think somehow Trump decides that the war has to end. And Iran is in a position where it can make certain demands. I don't know if a non-aggression pact will be right on the table right away, but I think with the regional leaders, Qatar and Emirates, Oman, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, they will all want a deal that is, somewhat gives them some security moving forward, assuming that the regime doesn't fall and assuming that there isn't a ground invasion by Trump, which is always possible. Apparently, I think on Wednesday, the first 2,500 Marines arrive in the region, which is, again, we could have a ground war. This is unknown. But yeah, I do think that there's a possibility once the shooting stops, and assuming that Trump can also persuade Netanyahu to stop shooting. Israel was bombing infrastructure last night, and they actually openly said, we're bombing infrastructure, which is, arguably against international law if you're bombing power plants and stuff like that. And Tehran had blackouts all over Tehran last night. So whether Trump can persuade Netanyahu to also stop shooting, then it becomes like, okay, yeah, I can see Iran. Iran needs sanctions relief. It absolutely needs that. If it doesn't get it, what's going to happen is another 6 months from now, they'll have another January 8th, where thousands of people get killed by the regime because, and that's not, sustainable in the long term. And they know that. The Iranian regime knows that. There's a reason why they were negotiating with Trump in February. They didn't really trust Witkoff and Kushner. They didn't really trust Trump, but they just come out of those protests in January that had started as economic protests and then turned into violent anti-regime protests by some of the protesters, not all. And what happened then, we all know what happened. We have to revisit that. But as far as the Iranian regime is concerned, that can't happen again. And, slaughtering more people, which they will have to do, they will do in their own minds to preserve the regime, is not sustainable in the long term. So but the only way you can get sanctions relief is to make a deal with Trump. That's it. There's no other way. They've tried it with the Europeans. They've tried it with the UK. They've tried it with Germany. They've tried to push when Trump first tore the deal up. They waited for a whole year before they violated the nuclear deal that Trump tore up. And they were telling the Europeans, you guys have to compensate for what Trump is doing. The Europeans were unable to. I'm not saying they didn't want to. They created this Instex, I think it was called, some kind of like bartering system where Iran could sell its oil and receive like goods in return instead of money to avoid the banking sanctions, all kinds of strange stuff. But anyway, the point is they still need, and that didn't work, by the way. So what they need is sanctions relief to get their economy back on track, assuming again that the regime survives, and get people, listen, the regime probably has between 10 and 20% hardcore loyalists. You see them whenever they call them out to come for rallies, for mourning ceremonies, funerals for the leadership. 10 to 20% of the population actually trust and believe in this regime. Another, I'd say 20, 30, 40% even maybe are actively against the regime and will come out, not always come out, but generally really want the regime gone. And then there's another group, maybe it's as many as 40% or 50% of the people who don't like the regime, but also aren't going to get killed to get rid of it. So what they really want is a better life. And so the regime knows that. The regime knows if it gives them a better life, it'll keep its 20% support, if it's 20, let's say, and it will get the other 40%. It's never going to get the ones who want to come out and actually overthrow the regime. But it will be able to probably get a majority who may not like them, but won't be a threat to the regime.
And what effect will this war have on the Iranian opposition? I want to sort of mention a New York Times article over the weekend. It said Israel thought it could spur rebellion inside Iran. That hasn't happened. And they report that the Mossad chief, David Barnea, told Trump that Mossad would likely be able to galvanize the Iranian opposition, igniting riots and other acts of rebellion. How delegitimizing is that for the Iranian opposition in wartime, when Israel is bombing Iranian infrastructure, to have the Mossad chief, or it being briefed that the Mossad chief has close ties to the Iranian opposition?
The ties that the Mossad has and the Israeli government has to the opposition is with the prince, the Shah's former prince, the Shah's son. He went to Israel. He's met with Netanyahu. He's clearly been briefed by Mossad. He's briefed Mossad. His supporters wave Israeli flags at rallies, including in London. I'm sure you've seen them on television or on social media. It's a very close partnership between the son of the Shah, and he is probably the most visible of and probably has the most support, I would say, even though it's not a majority in my opinion, and it's not possible to really know what kind of support he has inside Iran beyond people. Some people actually wanting him to come, other people saying, well, he's better than this. We don't really like it, but he's better than what we have now. So it's really hard to gauge because there aren't any really accurate polls on that. But no, I wrote in The Guardian on the weekend about the diaspora and the opposition, and it's incredibly divided. There are people who support this war still to this day. There are others who are coming to slowly regret it because they never thought that the war would include bombing infrastructure or killing school children, for example, and continuing to do so. And they're feeling that they're going to get blamed if the regime survives. It's like, oh, you guys called for this war, and look what this war has done. The regime is still there, and yet their infrastructure has been destroyed, and let's say 5,000 Iranians have lost their lives. So how are you going to justify that? So I think there's a lot of, the opposition is very divided. People see the regime as weak and potentially a regime that can be overthrown, but there is no ground operation inside Iran, other than people going out and protesting, that can take over the government. It's not like Khomeini in 1979 when he had a ground operation inside Iran because he had every single mosque in the entire country that were his headquarters, essentially came down to being his headquarters. And he had a government in exile almost with all his advisors around him. Pahlavi doesn't have that. The MEK, the Mujahideen, who used to be on the terrorist list of the United States, and I think Europe, most of Europe too, they're considered a cult. They have hardly any real support inside Iran because they sided with Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. So those are the two main opposition groups. They hate each other. They despise each other. They're willing to kill each other. I think Pahlavi, I don't know why he decided to ally himself with Israel, but I think given what's happening now with the war, he probably thought that this war would enable him, and with Israel wanting to start a war and being able to persuade a president like Trump that he should join in the war twice now, has probably given Pahlavi the idea, well, the reason he went to Israel in the first place, probably thought, this is my chance. This is the one chance I have. He's 63 years old. If he doesn't do it now and the regime doesn't collapse, that's pretty much it for him.
That was only the first half of my interview with Hooman Majd. A really interesting guy. And we sort of got a bit deeper as we went on, talked about his background, sort of meeting those Iranian presidents. You can watch that tonight at 9 p.m. The Economist is almost 200 years old. It's one of the most prestigious magazines in the English language. But when its editor-in-chief interviewed Tucker Carlson, she crumbled.
Clearly, I think you and I agree we have both been critical of the Israeli government. I just want to kind of clarify terms a bit here.
Well, I've really been critical of the Israeli government.
I've been plenty critical of the Israeli government. I've told you at the beginning that we were against this war.
What do you think of Gaza?
What do I think of Gaza?
Yeah.
I think the war in Gaza, to start with, was a perfectly reasonable response in response to the horrors of October 7th. I think now the places, I mean, I've been there. Have you been to Gaza? I've been to Gaza since the war started.
They would not
it's
let
catastrophic.
me into Gaza. Trust me, very few journalists get into Gaza.
Yeah, no, I went with the IDF. It's the only way that you can go in, but nonetheless you go in and you see a flattened place. I think it is a disaster for the future of Israel, a disaster for the Palestinian people, a horror, 70,000 people dead.
Why would you describe it first as a disaster for the future of Israel? You've got tens of thousands of civilians murdered, but it's foremost a disaster for the future of Israel? No, it's foremost a disaster for the families of the dead kids.
Absolutely. I made 3 points.
Because everybody sucks up to Israel in this way that suggests they're afraid. And everyone is afraid, and you know that. Everyone's like, the real problem is calling people anti-Semites allows real anti-Semites to flourish. It's like, no, actually, the real problem with calling people anti-Semites who aren't is accusing the innocent of a crime they didn't commit. And the real crime in Gaza is killing people who did nothing wrong. So those are the real problems, I would say. But no one can say it because you have to be like, oh no, but really, October 7th
I don't know what you're talking about, Gaza. We're having a...
Everyone watching this knows what I'm talking about.
It is true. Everyone watching it does know what he's talking about. I mean, you know, it's a shame watching Tucker Carlson in an interview and thinking that he's coming across as the more reasonable person. There's many unreasonable things about him, which we'll sort of talk about later when we talk about what this means for centrism and liberalism, that it's getting snookered by a man like Tucker Carlson. For now, when Zanny Minton Beddoes, that's her name, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, she says she's been plenty critical of Israel. You know, I've even been to Israel. I've even been to Gaza with the IDF, of course, but I've been there. We should look at some of the coverage of the Gaza war from her newspaper. So on November the 2nd, when more than 8,000 Palestinians had been killed, thousands of them children, The Economist argued that Israel must fight on. We were told to ignore the Israeli government's genocidal language and instead see this as an anti-terror operation with some collateral damage on the side. Then in January 2024, when South Africa accused Israel of genocide at the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, this was The Economist's take. Charging Israel with genocide makes a mockery of the ICJ, and it diverts attention from the real humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which is just an incredible attempt at sort of gaslighting. We're opposing the claim at the ICJ because we think that if Israel were found guilty of genocide, it would make it harder to protect the people of Palestine. How does that argument work? Of course, and as Zanny Minton Beddoes said in that clip, the reason that they argued that Israel's war against Palestinians was justified and why it must continue and intensify is because the war was seen as a response to the horrors of October the 7th. The problem here, The Economist hasn't exactly reported on the events of that day accurately. Shashank Joshi is the defense editor of The Economist, and this is what he was tweeting in October 2023. I've been asked repeatedly and by serious people why the media circulated disinformation around Hamas beheading babies. So disinformation in quote marks. It was not disinformation. There was first-hand evidence from the start. You just didn't want to see it. On the 22nd of October, he doubled down, tweeting this. To every October 7th truther who has, for 2 weeks, denied the first-hand testimony that was already available and published, here is the head of Israel's National Forensic Medical Center. Many bodies, including those of babies, are without heads. Now, at the time when he tweeted that, I challenged Shashank on why no journalists have been shown any images, right? If we've got this quote, and this is evidence, you know, I'm not expecting the images to be published on Twitter, but the journalist should say, and we saw horrific images. No one did. It was all just based on quotes. He obviously said, I don't want to suggest what your ulterior motives might be. So he not only sort of amplified misinformation, which was being used to justify a genocide, he sort of accused anyone who questioned this very flimsy reporting of anti-Semitism is what was implied, let's face it. Let's go back to the interview, though, because this is the part that went most viral. It concerned the Economist editor asking Tucker Carlson whether Israel has a right to exist.
You are critical of the government of Israel. Do you believe in Israel's right to exist? Would you consider yourself a Zionist in that narrow definition?
What does that mean, a right to exist?
The existence of the political state of Israel as
but
it
has
existed,
a right. What does that mean?
That you think it should continue in its existence as a state right now. So you do not agree with Iran, for example.
Well, let me just ask, since you asked me the question, it's fair for me to get you to define the term so I can answer it. You've asked two questions. The first was, do you believe Israel has a right to exist? And the second question was, do you believe Israel should continue to go on as a nation state? And those are very different questions. So I often hear the phrase...
Having been created as a political entity in 1948,
does it have a right to exist? Is that what you're asking?
I don't want to get hung up on the right. Should it continue to exist? That's how I define narrowly Zionism.
Because the phrase you used was devised by the Israeli government. Of course, does it have a right to exist? And so my question to you would be, what does that mean?
Why don't you answer my question? It's a very simple question.
I don't know what your question is. Are you asking, does it have a right to exist, or do I want it to exist? Do I seek its destruction?
Fine, answer it that way.
Well, of course I don't seek its destruction.
Okay,
I've already said, as you know, because I said it to you, I don't want Israel to be destroyed or have to use nuclear weapons.
We've established that you are in that narrow terms of Zionist. If that's how
I'm in no sense a Zionist. I don't want any country to be destroyed at all, and I don't want people to die, particularly ones who committed no crime, because I don't believe in killing innocents, period. That's the basis of Western civilization.
So therefore you are a Zionist. The whole Zionism, anti-Zionism, I just say I want, I don't want ethno-nationalism, I don't want genocide, I don't want ethnic cleansing, but I don't really care where the borders of various states are, because I'm not a Zionist, I'm not an Arab nationalist. I'm just like, let's sort of have some justice. I think go back to sort of international law is often the basis of it. But she's saying, you're a Zionist because you say, well, what does it mean? What does it mean? She's clearly quite uncomfortable. Let's look at the end of that conversation.
My question is, what right are you talking about? Does Britain have a right to exist? Does the United States have a right to exist?
There was a world order built up after 1945 which suggested that aggression should not be condoned into countries, that countries with borders have the right to continue.
I totally agree with that.
Okay.
Which is why the first thing that Israel did within 2 weeks of this war starting, which is supposedly existential for them, was take southern Lebanon, take someone else's country, as they have done repeatedly. And no one even mentions that. And so I guess I would be opposed to that, because I think Lebanon has a right to exist. I thought Gaza had a right to exist. But I noticed that as soon as we start apportioning rights, only one country gets them.
No, I did not say that. You're absolutely putting words into my mouth.
So because I believe, here's what I do believe, since you asked. I believe in universally applicable standards. And if they're not universally applicable, they're not standards, they're preferences. That's why I believe in human rights, not ethnic rights. I don't think Jews have more rights or less rights than anyone else. I don't think Christians have more rights or less rights, blacks, Filipinos. I believe in human rights that derive from the creation of people by God.
And I think this is the big problem for the kind of centrism that The Economist has found. I mean, it's always been tied to, and sort of being tied into the national security state. But backing this ethno-nationalist project that is sort of Israel, and it's very explicitly ethno-nationalist at the moment and expansionary. I think if you want to be ethno-nationalist but you're not expansionary, there are vague things going on there. But you have a pretty fascist state which is ethno-nationalist, which sort of stands against everything that liberalism stands for, and is sort of trying to destroy as many countries as possible in its neighborhood so it can be the last one standing. Right? The fact that liberalism has tied itself to Israel, or this form of sort of centrist liberalism, so closely to Israel, means that it can get outflanked on universal rights from Tucker Carlson. Now, Tucker Carlson, make no mistake, right? He, I think just in the last couple of weeks, made a video which was basically quite approving of Oswald Mosley. So the video was trying to demonize Winston Churchill. He was saying that Winston Churchill arrested Oswald Mosley. The only crime was that he opposed Churchill. He was putting Oswald Mosley as like an anti-war figure and saying that they called him unpatriotic when there was nothing unpatriotic about him. He never mentioned in the video, he also called him the main opposition party. He never mentioned in the video that he was a fascist. And I think the reason why, Tucker Carlson is sharing something which is implicitly praising Oswald Mosley without telling you he's a fascist is because he wants to launder fascists, right? He's had people on his his podcast where they've been arguing that the real baddie of the Second World War was Winston Churchill, not Adolf Hitler. Now, obviously, our audience don't need being told that Winston Churchill was no angel. But in that war, he was the good guy, right? If you're trying to relitigate the Second World War, which is something that Tucker Carlson sometimes sort of seems to flirt with, you shouldn't be winning an argument against the Economist editor about sort of equal rights, regardless of ethnicity. But on Israel, he does have them snookered. And I think it is a real problem for the brand of the kind of centrist liberalism that The Economist represents.
Yeah, well, on the centrism, it's kind of like it's that age-old thing of progressive except Palestine, right? We've seen that from the center a lot before. Tucker Carlson's politics are all over the place, it seems, right now. And yes, he does often launder fascism. So it's odd for us to find ourselves in a position where we're kind of lauding Tucker Carlson here. But I think it also speaks to the fact that, you know, again, in the US, we're seeing sympathy for the Palestinians surge like never before. And we are seeing some of Trump's MAGA base realize that he has not pursued his America first policy. And I think that they are starting to criticize it slowly. But I'm really glad that this clip went viral because I think that there is so much that's interesting about it, and there is so much that it says about mainstream journalism and centrism and propaganda talking points, etc. So let's just pause for a second on the right to exist question. Does Israel have a right to exist? It's a nonsense question. It's an absurd question. It's pure propaganda. It's effectively stratcoms. The Israeli government came up with it. No other country is ever told that it has a right to exist. Does the UK have a right to exist? Does Ireland have a right to exist? Does Northern Ireland have a right to exist? Did the former Yugoslavia have a right to exist? Does South Sudan, the world's youngest country formed in 2011, have a right to exist? I think that Francesca Albanese put it brilliantly about a year ago when she said, look, the premise of the question is absurd. Does it have a right to exist? It exists. It is a fact that it exists as a nation recognized by the UN. But there is nothing in international law to say that a nation has the right to exist. What there is in international law is something to say that peoples have a right to exist. And what there is in international law is something that says that people have the right to self-determination. So Israel's quote-unquote right to exist, the fact of Israel's existence, doesn't give it the right to run an apartheid state and to perpetrate a genocide against the Palestinian people. But I also think what Tucker Carlson's pushback shows is that there are a growing number of people from all sides of the political spectrum who have now got the confidence to push back against these long-standing talking points, whether it's Israel has a right to exist or Israel has a right to defend itself. People are pushing back on the very premise of the question. I think that's super interesting. And what you see is that when people push back, there's utter confusion from the person asking the question. Like the editor of The Economist there, she had this kind of quizzical, furrow-browed, confused expression when he asked her what did she mean by that. And she was looking at Tucker Carlson like he was playing a trick, like he was engaging in a negotiating tactic, like he was the one who was going for the gotcha moment, when she was the one playing the trick, when she was the one going for the gotcha. But it's like she couldn't even realize that, because for years and years, mainstream journalists and the kind of people who rise to a position like she occupies have imbibed and grown up with and absorbed the talking points of the Israeli government, the talking points of the British government, the talking points of the US government. And what they do is they believe those talking points to be fact, right? And so they think, and people in the comments will have a go at me and say, no, they're deliberately lying. Yes, sometimes. But really, a lot of the time what happens is senior Western journalists fully believe that they're wielding the trusty sword of truth, even though all they're doing is echoing propaganda and stratcoms. Can I tell you a story?
Go on.
Back in 2017, I happened to be in a newsroom on the day that Martin McGuinness died. Now, just in case any of our audience doesn't know who he was, Martin McGuinness was a former commander of the IRA. He was also a former Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland. He was also the former Education Minister of Northern Ireland. And he's somebody who's credited alongside other people with being a key figure to getting the Good Friday Agreement done in Northern Ireland. The day he died, in that newsroom, it was going to be the lead story. In the newsroom that day, by a coincidence, almost every journalist was British. The presenter on the day was British. I watched them lose their minds about how to describe Martin McGuinness. They went back and forward, they argued, they debated. First of all, they said, should we call him a terrorist? Somebody pointed out, well, I said, we don't say the word terrorist. They said, oh, okay, what if we call him a paramilitary? No, I'm not sure. What if we call him a militant? And then somebody piped up and said, oh, how about we call him a self-confessed terrorist? Like, I watched this in amazement, right? Because we had a clear style guide. We did not say the word terrorist. We did not call people a terrorist group. We called them an armed group. We did not say militant. We did not say paramilitary. If you were a fighter in a group, you were called a fighter of the group. If you were a leader of the group, you were called a leader of the group. Now, that was a policy that we applied to Al-Shabaab, to Al-Qaeda, to FARC in Colombia. It didn't matter. That was the editorial policy. But when these British journalists were faced with reporting on the IRA, the editorial policy went out the window. Such was the kind of the propaganda that they'd been raised with, because they had spent their entire lives watching BBC's coverage of Northern Ireland. They had spent their whole time watching British coverage of Northern Ireland. They had spent their whole time being told one particular thing about the Northern Ireland conflict, and they had been taught a way to frame it that in that moment led to them being unable to stick by the basic rules that we had as a news organisation. Now, that is the same cloth that Zanny Minton Beddos is cut from as a senior British mainstream journalist. She has a view of the world, and her view is that Israel is a good faith actor, that Israel does not deliberately target civilians, that Israel does not deliberately kill children, that Israel is not and would never be engaged in a genocide. And she thinks, as she showed in the way that she looked at Tucker Carlson, she thinks that everybody who thinks different is biased, never recognizing that she's the biased one.
I think it is I think the Israel thing is a bigger problem for liberalism. And I'll explain why. Because with the IRA, like, liberalism has always found it very easy to say, look, we're in favor of self-determination and justice, but also we're against political violence. And if, Irish Republicans wanted independence, they should have done it at the ballot box, right? There's lots of arguments against that, but most of the arguments against that are quite radical arguments, right? So liberalism, I don't think, really struggled with sort of being opposed to armed groups in liberal democracies. I mean, you can say Northern Ireland wasn't quite a liberal democracy, but you see where I'm going with
Definitely
this.
Wasn't.
They can make that argument quite confidently. I think Israel, especially now, has become, it's not opposing what Israel is doing now is not a radical thing. Like, liberalism really should be so against this right now. You've got an expansionary ethno-state. Like, liberalism, its justification through time has been it believes in individual rights. The biggest justification has been that standards of living have improved. But then also, it was liberalism alongside communism that defeated the Nazis. So they can say, we're against the ethno-nationalists. The Americans were generally supportive of decolonization, even if they then went and couped a few leaders who they didn't quite believe in. But there was an argument that they could put forward, which was to say, we are the most powerful force that has raised living standards and that is against reactionary ethno-nationalism. And now it's found itself so closely allied with this state, with this project, which is so clearly expansionary and ethno-nationalist, that it's just discrediting of the entire thing. And I feel like some of them are waking up to the fact that associating their brand with Israel, obviously there are always contradictions in what liberals support and don't support. And when it was, the Israel run by the Labour Party, the Israeli Labour Party, I think probably those contradictions could somewhat be smoothed over, not necessarily ethically, but politically. Now they just can't. And I think this is going to really do some damage to centrist liberalism, which has its problems, but has also been in many ways a force for good. I feel like them going down with Israel we're not necessarily going to like what comes afterwards if that's what happens next.
Watch everyone slamming you for defending centrism.
Yeah, well, I'm a much more. I'm Novara Media's moderate.
No. You're right. In that, I mean, I would say that, the West or Western countries supported decolonization and then under the table went right back into neo-colonialism and neo-imperialism. I know you know that. We all know that, right? But I think that it is a problem for liberals or so-called liberals and centrists because, look, the Democrats have never seen an Israeli action against Palestinians that they didn't like. Ultimately, Labour hasn't in recent years really seen an Israeli attack on Palestinians that they had a major problem with. And now we are in the midst of a genocide. A genocide, as everybody often points out, something that's been deemed a genocide by most, if not every, authoritative genocide scholar in the world, including Israelis. That's been deemed a genocide by the Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, and you can go on and on and on and on. Isn't it crazy that it might have taken a genocide for liberals and centrists to realize that they have a problem with their support for Israel? And, even the defense editor from The Economist, who you had the spat with on Twitter over the weekend, he's now started to delete his tweets, right? He's deleted some of the tweets to you, right?
Yeah, all my conversations. The conversation was in 2023 and he's deleted all his parts of the exchange.
Yeah, so he's scared, isn't he? He's frightened that, these tweets are going to be pulled up.
History isn't going to look back kindly on his support.
That will show that he bought into the beheaded babies thing, which we all know was complete nonsense. And I think I said on Twitter yesterday, it smelled bad from the beginning. And he is, as a journalist for one of the most prestigious news organizations, or one of the most prestigious sort of newspapers, magazines on the planet. And it was obvious to anybody with professional journalism training, anybody who'd worked in news, that story, as reported, was full of holes. Even the mass rape story, when Screams Without Words came out in the New York Times, just on a pure reading of the text as a journalist, when you looked at the sourcing, it was awful. I couldn't believe that it even got through the editing process. Now, Shashank Joshi is a very experienced journalist. How did he not realize that? Because the burden of proof when it comes to reporting on Palestine is just not bloody there. But I think the fact that he's deleting his tweets and the fact that people are starting to backtrack a little bit, liberals and centrists and so-called progressives, shows that they're getting worried.
I meant to do this today, but I didn't get around to it. So I'm cheating and I've asked ChatGPT, did The Economist support apartheid South Africa? Short answer, yes, at times. So in the early and the mid 20th century, they took a pro-free market, anti-sanctions stance. They said that economic growth would liberalize South Africa. Then in the 70s and the 80s, at the height of the global anti-apartheid movement, they did criticize apartheid as morally wrong, but continued to oppose sanctions and divestment campaigns, favoring dialogue. And then in the late 80s and 1990s, they became more clearly supportive of major political reform. So
why are you doing a Matt Goodwin?
Maybe there's that's what, I haven't. Matt Goodwin has written a book where lots of the references are ChatGPT, and lots of people are accusing him of hallucinating them. I think reading from ChatGPT when you're clear you're reading from ChatGPT on YouTube, I'd say is more legitimate than writing it in your book and trying to pass it off as not from ChatGPT. Counter-terrorism police are investigating after an arson attack on 4 ambulances owned by a Jewish community service in North London. CCTV footage captured in the early hours of Monday morning shows 3 people approaching one of the ambulances near a synagogue in Golders Green before setting it on fire and running away. The Met Police are treating the incident as an anti-Semitic hate crime. They've said it has not yet been declared a terrorist incident, although counter-terror officers are involved. The ambulances were owned by Zola, which is a volunteer-led Jewish charity that provides free medical transport and emergency services for local residents. The fire caused oxygen canisters in the ambulances to explode, breaking the windows of some nearby homes. But there were no initial reports of injuries. A number of people were evacuated from their homes while the fire was brought under control. There hasn't been any confirmation as to who might be responsible. I mean, you can see there really appalling scenes of those ambulances blown up. However, an Iran-linked group called Harakat Ashab al-Yamin al-Islamiyah has claimed responsibility online. Police have stressed that they don't yet know how reliable that claim is. This is what Detective Chief Superintendent Luke Williams had to say earlier, speaking at the scene of the fires.
We are aware of an online claim from a group taking responsibility for this attack. Establishing the authenticity and accuracy of this claim will be a priority for the investigation team, but it is not something we can confirm at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to do too much speculating because I feel like we don't know. Sort of when I first saw the headline, Iran linked to this, I was a bit like, come on, is this really Iran doing it? But this group there have been attacks in other European cities where this group online has claimed responsibility. So I definitely don't feel in a position to sort of poo-poo a possible connection. I don't see how it would benefit Iran for that to happen. But yeah, I don't feel like I'm in a position to say that, that's mad. I don't know who did these fires. The main thing we said is what a nasty thing to do.
Not just about to say
not just target the Jewish community, but ambulances.
Yeah.
Like what? How much of a wrong-un do you have to be? Not to just obviously targeting any religious community is already horrific, outrageous, disgusting. Targeting ambulances run by a community group. I was interested because I often I see ambulances in Stamford Hill and around there, sort of run by the Jewish community. And I always thought that they were something to do with the Jewish community, sort of involving technology and, because there's often the Haredi communities don't want to use the same. I thought it was just for Jewish people. I didn't have any resentment about that. I was like, fine, they've got their own ambulances. There's no skin on my teeth. But apparently this organisation, and maybe all of them, they do provide ambulance services to everyone. So this is a really good organisation providing ambulance services to residents in the community, and their ambulances get firebombed.
Yeah, it's horrible. It's a really, really nasty attack. It's a pointless attack. It's a bizarre attack. And as you say, this appears to be a really positive, much needed group. I think when you look at response times for the ambulance service in London, a volunteer medical service can only be a very welcome thing. But apparently this group was started, I've looked into it today, apparently it was started in New York, yes, in order to provide this sort of emergency response service to, at the time, primarily Hasidic Jews because of language reasons, but also, cultural, religious reasons too. But yeah, you can call them whether you're Jewish or not. And I've seen several people coming out today saying that they have called them and had incredible service from them. And so it's just a bizarre target. In terms of the group, the Iran-linked group, I think the thing about that is that there's very little information out there, even from, sort of terror monitoring groups, organizations that monitor extremist groups. It's a relatively new group, and there is very, very little known about it. So I do think that
it might also not exist.
Well, right. It could be just, a group that's inspired by what's happening in Iran, or, we don't know. We don't know what Iran-linked means in this context, right? That's the thing. We just don't know what Iran-linked means in this context. But what we do know is that there is a lot of hay to be made by Israel and by the far right in this country by immediately pinning the blame on Iran. And we've already seen that today. There's always this thing where they leverage these horrible, horrible attacks to make a political point, rather than express any concern for the people who've been attacked or being killed or have lost their ambulance service. It's just, I think Robert Gendra came out today and said, stop the boats. So, they will weaponize it. It's a nasty, nasty attack, but I don't think we know enough about it at this stage.
Yeah. Let's wrap up. Thank you, Barry, for joining me this evening.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.